In this video, I'm going to be philosophizing on emotional sensitivity concerning the personality characteristics within emotional sensitivity as it pertains to distinctions within reactiveness, responsiveness, and or proactivity-inactivity, and or approach-avoidance, most meaningfully involving certain direct perception responses and or reactions to stressors as one uniquely perceives a stressor. To constitute X stressor, an existing direct perception need perceive the stressor and or influence direct and or indirect perceptions related to a stress response. Engaging reactivity and or responses dependent on an individual's emotional sensitivity, and or in some cases individuals tend to be more averse and or psychophysiologically sensitive to stressors, yet individuals should engage more optimistic and or emotion-focused coping within direct perceptions to mitigate the harms with oversensitivity, as being overly sensitive is often more detrimental, be it an individual engages counterproductive threat perception, not to mean being more discerning in terms of one's sensitivity to, with a higher acuity, identify and or more immediately recognize appropriately certain stressors one should be more wary of. This does not mean worry. It means wary, to be cognizant. And cognizance is meaningful to engage the internal and or external monitoring of distinct changes in one's subjective well-being. Yet, it's also meaningful to distinguish cognizance from emotional intelligence, as cognizance is more an ability one fosters that allowances for us to cultivate emotional intelligence, yet it's not uniquely related to emotional sensitivity. Emotional sensitivity pertains to distinctions more in our receptiveness to distinct stressors, be it that one may be more reactive and or engage maladaptive direct perceptions in comparison to responsiveness, and an individual who tends to be more responsive to stressors engages direct perceptions that are more adaptable and optimistic in terms of proactivity in resolving issues within one's direct perception. With the may-dos, perceiving the factavel solutions instead of ruminating over the issues and or panicking. That is often what the individual whom is more hostile resorts to, engaging what are often dogmatic assumptions in terms of all or nothing thinking that are antagonizing one's existentia and or resulting in misconducts that are reacting instead of responding appropriately to resolve the issues, and or engage more emotional focused within direct perception coping skills. And be it that I'm not discussing emotional regulation, so I haven't discussed yet anything that is outside an individual's perception in terms of perceiving stressors. Uniquely, I am most concerned with communicating here, resolving issues within our perception and or how one frames a stressor, as the framing of the stressor is most meaningful to infer certain related reactions and or responses, and be it that one whom is reacting to something often perceives it and or may immediately and or within the near and or far term engage in certain direct perception conduct, including certain negative and or positive thought processes that are meaningful for an individual's perceptions. Not necessarily the coping strategies, yet the coping strategies should be connected to the direct perceptions. And then that's why you see emotional sensitivity correlated with emotional regulation within emotional intelligence closer together than cognizance. Yet, emotional sensitivity is more unique to direct perception processes, including perceiving approaches and or avoidances. Should I approach a certain potential threat to identify the existencia of certain intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties within what is proportionate to alleviate unnecessary suffering, be it that there are little risks in terms of identifying a certain meaningful concern an individual has. For example, one may be meaningfully concerned that there is mold on one's sandwich in the fridge that they had left for 2 weeks. Be it that one is perceiving the sandwich to be a hazard and or potentially contain pathogens that could get one sick within one's fridge, one may perceive just leaving it there, avoiding it altogether. And or an individual may think one should approach the sandwich, and the approaching the sandwich to increase one's actual factual probabilistic self-knowledge and or self-awareness may allow an individual to resolve the uncertainty that may be causational of certain symptoms of anxiety and or certain other psychopathologies, including potentially mostly post-traumatic stress disorder that may be more related to panic. Not necessarily depression, but in the situation, an individual whom is perhaps avoiding consuming certain foods altogether may experience depression in relation often to other more compounding negative perceptions that are more likely to relate to incompetence and not necessarily directly to the sandwich, yet maybe more indirect to the sandwich in the fridge and more likely to result from other personality characteristics that are more meaningful in terms of indicating low emotional or high emotional sensitivity, not low emotional sensitivity. As the more emotional sensitive an individual tends to be, the more problematic certain panic responses are. Yet low emotional sensitivity is also problematic in terms of individuals who are more likely to be psychopathic. So, uniquely as it pertains to emotional sensitivity, the desired score would be more within the mean, not necessarily within the exact middle, yet within 40 to 60% of the central variance in terms of where most individuals would fall on a standard deviation from the norm, to hold within the measures of central tendency the most emotionally sensitive in terms of what results mostly in detriment to one's well-being is more closer to what allowances for okayness in terms of one's appropriate responses to stressors. And this is more unique as the personality characteristics you may read that I have written about most concern what ideally an individual should desire to be more in terms of a high score, being that an individual whom is high, say, in emotional regulation is more likely to be more competent, and or an individual whom is higher in temperance is also more likely to be more competent in terms of engaging more balanced conduct. And an individual who is more emotionally sensitive may be more likely to be lower in other areas of emotional intelligence. This is not always the case, however, as individuals who may be more emotionally sensitive in some cases may also be able to engage more temperate conducts within other domains that they are more competent in, be it that they are more sensitive for distinct psychophysiological sensitivities. However, these individuals would most likely also struggle with certain emotional regulation skills and therefore would have certain deficits intrinsically within emotional intelligence. So you should avoid desiring to be an individual whom is sensitive per se to stressors. Instead, you should be more cognizant of stressors, cultivating duty of care, not necessarily emotional sensitivity. To optimize the most healthy psychological functioning, emotional sensitivity, you should engage more coping skills within emotional regulation to build your perceptions. Yet, if you were most concerned with engaging the appropriate future-oriented direct perception, uniquely within emotional sensitivity, you may engage more optimisms and thinking within your perception to optimize and or build on the positivities and or optimisms within your direct perception to reframe the stressors and engage more introspective investigations in what's more appropriate in terms of building the meaningful thinking processes, engaging critical thinking to eliminate superstitions and or supernaturalisms that are more likely to result in one extreme direction and or the other with all or nothing thinking. Be it individuals who tend to be more hostile, engage more dogmatic dogmatic panic responses without engaging optimisms and or positivities, meaning that they are more likely to engage hostile, be it an individual is more engaging in masculine responses, be it a boy and or a man, is more likely to engage in aggression and or violent forms of hostility, compared to girls and or women whom are more feminine are more likely to engage in social aggression and or gossip and or may also engage in negative self-talk. Yet boys and or men also engage in negative self-talk. There are some distinctions in the self-talk itself that are harmful to one's subjective well-being and often counterproductive. Engaging the optimisms is more meaningful to optimize positive self-talk, more specifically building up what's called positive constructive self-talk, building within one's direct perception more meaningful, compassionate identification of the stressor and or brainstorming solutions to one's experiential encounters of the issue, approaching it, not avoiding it within one's direct perception, to identify and or resolve the issue proactively. So one is not ruminating on the issue, yet working towards solving the issue. Responding, not reacting. Responding meaning that one is processing information as it's incoming to respond appropriately to the underlying needs relevant and or appropriate and or meaningful to treat the suffering one may be experiencing in relation to certain underlying psychological need deprivations and or hurt feelings and or certain feelings of fear and or anxiety, be it one is engaging reactivity. This is uniquely where an individual may experience psychological distress. And this is a meaningful distinction, as be it one is experiencing stress, one may not experience psychological distress. Psychological distress is uniquely more harmful, as one is more likely to engage panic and or certain reactive responses instead of proactive responses within one's direct perception. Responding, not reacting again. And psychological distress is more likely to result in a chronic stress response that's more likely to result in strain to distinct mind-body connections that is well established. And there is a vast ranging literature from distinct disciplines connecting strain to the detrimental effects on chronic disease related to obesity, type 1 and type 2 diabetes, coronary heart disease, high blood pressure, hypertension, schizophrenia, depression, generalized anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and symptoms of various psychotic disorders related to psychosis, each with extreme detrimental consequences to certain mind-body connections within the self that are causational from the self, not mind-body connections. Uniquely, it's your direct perception, how you treat the stressor that is responsible for those causations resulting from stress. So you are the meaningful variable, meaning that your reactions and or your responsiveness is most meaningful to the positive and or negative direction of the outcomes in your existentia. So engaging more proactive, optimistic, positive, constructive self-talk is meaningful to prevent and or mitigate the harms of stress-related causations that are more likely to result in unnecessary suffering and or ultimately inflammation that's the number one contributor to chronic disease resulting from maladaptive stress reactivity, not necessarily responses, as responses are mostly adaptive. Engaging conducts, not necessarily misconducts. Reactions and reactivity are more likely to engage in misconducts, resulting in, more specifically, as it pertains to sex and gender meaningful similarities, misconducts. Girls and or women are more likely to be hospitalized for, and or boys and or men are more likely to be put into prison for engaging in criminality, and in some cases may be hospitalized. For maladaptive responses that are not necessarily appropriate responses and are most meaningfully categoricalized as reactivity and or panic. And panic is categoricalized under reactiveness, not necessarily responsiveness. And uniquely within reactivity, an individual is engaging more dogmatic perceptions. So there are more assumptions and or vagueness in terms of one's thinking. This is most meaningfully why individuals will report confabulating and or vast-ranging gaps in meaningful information in terms of their memories, with difficulty in terms of often organizing coherently their existing prior meaningful memories, with dysfunctions and or meaningful abnormalities within the HPA axis and or more meaningful abnormalities within the hippocampus responsible for learning and or memory that is responsible for the dysfunctional activations in terms of memory. The more reactive an individual is to certain stressors. Now, an individual whom is, be it within the personality characteristics recommendations I have reorganized in terms of reconstituting emotional sensitivity, individuals who would be high in emotional sensitivity would be more competent, as if an individual is more responsive, an individual is more proactive, and an individual is more approaching in terms of certain stressors, an individual is more likely to be more competent. Not necessarily more emotionally sensitive per se, yet more able to cope within one's direct perception and or be more discerning of the appropriate stress connecting to the appropriate stress response as one is inferring meaningful similarities within coherent crystal clarity of meaningful utterances of thought, the appropriate approaching of the stressor within direct perception navigations to identify the meaningful similarities existing past prior to other problems an individual uniquely has resolved within what is relevant, appropriate, and or meaningful to the problem. So not irrelevant, so not some other random problem, not that one has experienced stress before per se and or has lived. This is not appropriate to responding meaningfully to certain stressors. It's the meaningful similarities in terms of the stressors, relevant and or appropriate and or meaningful, that are proportionate to appropriately identify the problems and or engage meaningful solutions to those problems from existing past priors that one has engaged the existing priors concerning what has worked. And it's the positive consequence in what works that one may treat appropriately the stressor in terms of what is responsible for one's stress-related direct perceptions. Engaging more perspectival processes to engage creative thinking within the optimisms and or positivities, fueling one's creative thinking and or solution seeking, and are ultimately more optimizing even of conflict resolution skills that are perhaps the most meaningful in terms of optimizing responsiveness, proactivity, and or approaching. The most meaningful skills to work on would be creative solution seeking to identify and or connect the intracategorical and or intercategorical effectivenesses and or efficiencies to resolve the intracategorical and or intercategorical ineffectivenesses and or inefficiencies, to treat the problem, solving the problem from correctly identifying the problem and or the workable working solutions to the problem. Engaging meaningful conflict resolution skills that are more likely to build optimisms and or positivities that allow for an individual to ultimately engage more resilience and or future-oriented hopefulness within one's conducts, having conducted the optimisms that are most meaningful. Individuals who tend to be more pessimistic are impaired mostly in terms of certain disabilities and or deficiencies and or impairments in terms of self-knowledge and or self-awareness, engaging resilient and or hopeful and or efficacious conducts, including optimisms, as optimisms are on the opposite polarity of pessimisms. They tend to be more likely to antagonize themselves and experience more reactivity to certain issues and or experience more symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, compared to individuals who often are more likely to engage the appropriate creative thinking to resolve conflicts, engaging meaningful conflict resolution skills that are most meaningful to build optimisms within one's being and optimize one's subjective well-being. So I want to say for this video. Hope you have an awesome one. Keep on this episode.